of my other main practice areas right now is property tax appeals and objections. It's very, very exciting, but they can cut into you, and sometimes they get raised and you have no idea why. What are they basing it on? And then dealing with the assessors frankly can oftentimes be a pain in the ass. So let's, I guess, talk about a little bit of what you have to go through during property tax time. My colleague Russ Carnes and I, we practice property tax litigation across the state of Wisconsin, and we've probably had appeals in most of the counties in Wisconsin for various commercial properties. I think I've got it working now. So this is my thought of what it feels like when government's doing the taxing.
Hello. Can I help you? Hi, my class is here in a field trip. I'm supposed to interview someone for a school project.
Okay. You can wait at that table, and someone will be here sometime.
But aren't you here now?
No. Look, little girl, can we postpone this for another day? It's unsettling having you just sit there.
My clothes too small.
What's it on?
My government matters.
Really? It's never too early to learn that the government is a greedy piglet that suckles on a taxpayer's teat until they have sore chapped nipples. I'm gonna need a different metaphor to give this 9-year-old. What's your name, ma'am?
Lauren Lucas.
Lauren. My name is Ron Swanson, and I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about the miserable, screwed up world of local government.
You must in your mustache.
Don't sass me, Burkus. Let's get started. Life, liberty, and property. John Locke. This is your lunch. Now, you should be able to do whatever you want to with this, right? You want to eat all of it? Great. If you want to throw it away in the garbage, that's your prerogative. But here I come. The government. And I get to take 40% of your lunch. And that, Lauren, is how taxes work.
That's not fair.
Learn that. Uh-oh. Capital gains tax.
It feels like that sometimes when you're getting your assessments in the mail, and then you're trying to figure out what is it actually based on, because sometimes the assessors don't even know. In terms of real property tax assessments in general, they're based on the assessed values as of January 1 of the preceding year. They relate them to the fair market value of the property, and they have these fun things called mill rates and all this type of other nonsense to figure out what you exactly have to pay every year. Sometimes it's in quarterly installments, sometimes it's twice a year. But the main thing to think about when you get a notice of your assessment is what are you going to do about it, and what's the plan going to be in that regard. You need to plan and have an idea of how you want to object. If you're going to object, if it's fair or it's not fair. If you've got a reduction, well, good for you. Maybe you want to stay with that. Maybe you think it should be reduced more. My guess is most everybody probably has it usually raised a good deal yearly or whenever they do an evaluation year. In terms of the process, it is going through a property tax appeal is a tortured procedural mess in Wisconsin, but that's why there are lawyers to deal with these fun aspects of administrative law. Eventually it gets to court, but you have to basically jump through a lot of hoops and deadlines and all sorts of fun little things before you get there. You start with, there's an open book process, which is basically the time that your jurisdiction is open to talk with an assessor. Sometimes there are assessors that are employees of the city, the village, or the town. Sometimes they're employees, and sometimes they're contract assessors that are hired to provide assessment services for the local villages and town. There's some statutes that deal with them in terms of these property tax assessments. I'll get to some more of the specifics about the Board of Review, but this is the part where Board of Assessors, it's an additional little procedural step before you get to the Board of Review. You have to file an objection if you're in essentially a first-class city, which is one of the, basically Milwaukee, Kenosha, Madison. If you're in one of those cities, you have to file, and you're taxed by one of those cities, you have to file an objection with the assessors before you get to the Board of Review. It's very exciting. Then after that, you go to the Board of Review, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Those are essentially citizen neighbors and other people who are appointed in volunteer capacity in local government. So completely reasonable people who are dealing with whether they will grant or rule on your tax adjustment. Once you get to that process, and there's a number of ways you can approach the action at the Board of Review, you can then file another claim after the first of year for an excessive assessment. There's a certiorari claim, which is basically an appeal based on the record at the hearing, a DOR appeal. You don't want to do that. You wouldn't go in that direction. Don't ever want to do that. Or if you get a waiver, you can go directly to circuit court, which means you're in litigation, which means it's going to get more expensive because you have to hire, or you have to at least plan to have an appraiser. And that's one of the points I want to get across here in terms of a property tax challenge, is it's always good to try to head it off at the open book, but in order to do that and talk to the assessor, you've got to have some ammunition to give either yourself or the lawyer or somebody who's assisting you and some sort of argument to tell the assessor why he or she is wrong in whatever they're assessing. Sometimes an appraisal helps, sometimes it doesn't. It could be a number of factors. That's the weekend trying to figure out the procedural maze in Wisconsin. It's pretty accurate. Even lawyers have trouble with it sometimes. Open book is an informal process. Basically, you can call and schedule a time to meet with the assessor. You can email them. You can have your information ready to email them right when it happens. But it's good to talk to them on the phone and hear what they have to say. Sometimes it's harder for them to tell you no once you get them on the phone. One of the things that I imagine comes up with your type of properties and your type of business and dealing with assessors, and you might have some experience with this, is have you ever had an assessor ask you to share income and expense information or sales information? That's kind of aggravating for a number of different reasons, and there's a couple people here. Shouldn't necessarily matter if you go by the hierarchy of how properties are supposed to be assessed. You know, usually the best thing for a property tax holder or a property owner to go in with are comparable sales, because comparable sales show what the market is when property is for sale at the market. Now, golf courses are one of these properties I imagine that sell too often, and when they do, they're under. There's different reasons for those sales. That's why the statute talks about arm's length sales. Are they sales between a person who owns it and somebody in the club? Is it a distressed financial sale? All of these things are taken into consideration. Ideally, you want to use comparable sales, and sometimes maybe you think you have to go outside the state to find those. This is why it's a good idea to have an appraiser on your side, because when you try to talk to an assessor about comparable sales, you basically have it's them with a cross. No, they don't want to talk about comparable sales. They do not want to hear about it. Why is that? Because generally they're lower. unless it's a leased fee sale, then it's not something they're going to want to consider. Does anybody know or have an idea of what I mean when I talk about a fee simple sale versus a leased fee sale? Fee simple essentially is if you sell the property and you're selling it to a buyer, and if they get it, they're getting the whole property. There's everything. There's not an additional real estate trust or entity that you're paying rent to or leases to over a year. Sometimes some of these properties have 10 or 20-year leases, and you have some real estate trusts who come in and buy the lease, and they pay to the trust certain rents and income. Assessors like to use those because those are really based on the credit and the credit worthiness of the tenant. But fee simple sales are usually total sales where the total title of the property is passed along to the buyer. Those are better sales to usually use in determining what the value of a property is. Board of Assessors, usually the first line of defense for the city of Milwaukee, Kenosha, and Madison. You won't necessarily have a hearing. A lot of times you just send them information. They ask about income and expense information. Here's the thing that stinks about that, and which is a problem in the system, is there's a statute that says if the assessor is using the income method to value your property, in order to file an appeal, you have to share certain income and expense data with them, or else they won't hear your case. They have a procedural thing where if you don't get the right information to them, 7 days before, they won't hear your appeal. And one of their favorite defenses to this is a nice procedural defect, kind of like this case. So it's important to make your deadlines.
This is Kent Brockman live at the Springfield Post Office on Tax Day. It's literally the 11th hour, 10 p.m., and tardy taxpayers are scrambling to mail the returns by midnight. Sir, why did you wait until the last minute to pay your taxes?
Taxes is listed items in italics.
Sir, why did you wait until the last minute to pay your taxes?
Because I'm an idiot. Happy?
Of course, not everyone is an idiot. Some of us took our receipts and pay stubs to our accountants months ago. Isn't it the risk of sounding a little smug?
Help! Does anyone have a calculator?
Myron? Oh,
You look at those morons. I paid my taxes over a year ago.
Dad,
What is it, sweetie? Did you see a scary picture in your picture book?
that was last year's tax. I paid again this year.
No, because you see, I went ahead and year-wise, I was counting forward from the last previous.
No! I put the tax forms on top of your to-do pile a month ago.
I have a to-do pile. March, how many kittens we have? Oh, no time to count, I'll just estimate. 9.
I know you don't have.
Shut off if I don't hear you, it's not illegal. Deductions. Oh, business gift. Here you go, keep using nuclear power.
I painted that for you.
Okay, Mark, if anyone asks, you require 24-hour nursing care. Lisa is a clergyman. Maggie is 7 people, and Barb was wounded in Vietnam.
Cool.
I don't see it. It's not illegal. You don't. I'm getting there.
And that's what it's like making your deadlines in the property tax world as well. If you're filing a property tax objection, if you want to be heard at the Board of Review hearing, which is essentially a precursor to bringing an appeal in circuit court, you have to have your appeal in 48 hours before the first hearing. That's if you can't come to an agreement with an assessor. One of the Board of Review's and the city's best defenses that they have is, oh, they didn't make this deadline. Oh, they didn't do this. It wasn't timely. There is a method if you get your objection in the day before, or the day of, the Board of Review can allow you to make the objection if they decide that there's good cause. Are they going to decide give you good cause if you're a large commercial business or property holder in the area? Good luck. Good luck. I don't know if anybody's ever had problems with those deadlines before, but dealing with the Board of Review and the clerks and scheduling these things, it's kind of a difficult and thorny process, and the case law is littered with cases about deadlines here, what was filed here, were income and expenses provided 7 days before. There's fights about that all the time, and there's nothing more exciting than tax lawyers fighting about deadlines. Board of Review, I mentioned this before. Has anybody ever served on a Board of Review? Yeah, okay. So maybe are you serving on a Board of Review now? I'll say maybe you already hate me. But so these are the people who essentially decide, among other things, certain property tax objections. I used to serve as an alternate at one in the city of Milwaukee, and we did some other things too. But now the Board of Review is, a lot of times appointed by different people in terms of the city, usually by the mayor or the village. Again, the objections filed with the Board of Review 48 hours before. There's forms. Oh, there's forms. Waivers. Usually, if you've got a case and it's in litigation, you think you're not going to resolve it, and the Board of Review is not going to rule in your favor, you ask for a waiver to go directly to circuit court and file a lawsuit there. Sometimes we do that in these cases because in order to prevent, you can pay a lawyer, pay an appraiser to go in and argue at a Board of Review, but oftentimes they're just a rubber stamp for what the assessor is going to say, and they want to sustain the value of the property. Sometimes you get good people on the Board of Review who listen to the evidence and want to do the right thing, but oftentimes it's kind of a truncated format to hear the case. There's not a lot of cross-examination or discovery, and it's a tough way to present an appeal. Since there's COVID, they've had Zoom appearances, which has made things easier for people wanting to appear. Usually, if you're far off, they want to try to make you appear in person. There are occasions where you can issue subpoenas, and sometimes there's adjournments and things of that nature, but getting in a long Board of Review fight is not usually good for cost efficacy if that's something you're looking for. The thing about the Board of Review is the assessors, because of the law, have a presumption of correctness. So no matter what happens in terms of the assessor, they may say your property is worth $20 million, it's only worth $2 million. They have a presumption of correctness, and you have to basically marshal enough evidence to overcome that presumption. Usually that's done with an appraiser. Appraisers don't come cheap normally. For a commercial property appraisal, sometimes it's for a tax case like this, you're looking in between $3,500 to $7,500, depending on who you hire and what's taken into effect. But sometimes that's what it takes in order to have a successful appeal and get somebody to listen to you. If you have an evidentiary hearing at the Board of Review, they do that because it can delay things for the Board of Review on occasion, or delay actions against the city. It sets forth a different set of statutory procedural things you have to follow. They can give you a disallowance. You get to go through responding in 3 months versus taking it directly to circuit court if they grant a waiver, and that's in 60 days. So basically they're thinking if they don't grant a waiver, they're going to avoid the certainty of litigation in 60 days versus putting it out till after the first of the year because that's when you can file a claim for excessive assessment. So they get some delay in that regard. Sometimes you can resolve some things in between then, but it depends not, because a lot of times assessors, like a lot of people, will take personal offense if you're challenging their assessment, so they take it personal. They may not want to modify it, especially if you are a large entity. This is just a little bit about assessments. I don't know how people's assessments have been the last year or two. It's been a weird time versus with COVID. A lot of retail and other office businesses saw maybe a little bit of a decline. Some retail places, they've raised property values. Golf, I imagine, I don't know how the golf industry, or specifically how people did individually. I've read that a lot of people did okay because golf was one of the things that people were allowed to do when COVID hit. But at the same time, if your income stream depends on weddings, parties, events, banquets, things of that nature, you might not have been able to generate as much. So did they raise or reduce your property accordingly? Did you get anything specific in any sort of hardship waivers during COVID? I don't know. I don't know if has anybody tried appealing their taxes during the COVID? Okay. That's where again, where we talk about why the assessors are going to want your income, because a lot of times they're going to value it in these types of cases based off of your income, whether that's right or wrong. That often becomes a fight that you have with courts. COVID had an impact on income-producing properties. It still probably is. In terms of the golf courses here, you have, how many people have like banquets, receptions, golf outings at their course? During the pandemic, did you have to shut those down for a period of time? And that's probably a significant moneymaker in the summer. Did your assessment necessarily reflect that the next year? That's something to consider. That's something that's not, was worthy of maybe taking to the assessor. Doesn't mean you have to file a case and litigate it, but if you take that issue to the assessor, you might be able to talk to them and get them to listen and reduce your taxes somewhat based on that. Again, you guys know your business in terms of what it is now. Is it up or down? I would suggest to think about some of the same things. We talked about some of the things that they can request in terms of information. Here's one of the nice fun forms that I'm sure people have, or owners that you might have received if you filed an objection. They also have a form that they send out at the beginning of the year if they're doing a revaluation of your property. They may send you something that looks like this. This might be something different, but that's where they're going to ask for your income. There's also a statute. It's important to know the law requires them to have, if they ask for your information, your income information, your things of that nature, they're supposed to have ordinance that keeps it confidential, so it's not subject to other people getting it. I wouldn't give that stuff over willy-nilly unless you have some sort of an agreement with the assessor. You've researched to make sure they have an ordinance that keeps it confidential, because there's some places that don't have that ordinance. And so you need to make some other arrangements with them to keep that information confidential, because you don't necessarily want competitors or anybody to be able to do an open records request on your property and get that type of information. There were some temporary changes to the practice where if you're having issues because of COVID and the impact on the business, you could go to the city or the board and ask to pay your taxes later as a hardship. There wasn't much else that Wisconsin did for people in that regard in terms of reducing the rates or anything like that. The most they really did was give people some time in terms of time to pay what they needed to do, but not too much in reductions or credits or anything else in that regard. The main thing I would say in regards to the property tax issues is if you're thinking about doing an appeal, one of the best times to do it is during the open book process, to do it early. Get as much information as you can to support why you think your property should be valued this number as opposed to this number, whether it be a recent appraisal, a sale of a nearby property, a sale of another golf course that you know of. Some sort of ammunition basically to take to the assessor and say, this is why I think it should be lowered. Or have somebody do that, in terms of your lawyer or whoever else. Talking with the assessor sometimes can be beneficial. You don't want to rush straight to litigation. But that's something to do too. Towns are very cognizant of that, and it also depends on the degree. If you're talking about a 60% property value hike, you might say, well, maybe it's worth it for 1 year, but these cases can often go on once you litigate them for three years or so, and you can resolve things. You may want to think about savings prospectively. Maybe not this first coming year, but in the long run, you want to set a tone to have it low or correct it so that a 1-year problem doesn't become a 5-year or a 10-year problem. So those are some things to consider in terms of making your appeals. Also, the deadlines. I hate to say the deadlines, they're very exciting, but the deadlines are one of the biggest killers in these cases, and people not preparing until it's time to file the objection right at the end. Then you miss your chance to talk to the assessor and try to sell him or her on a lower value. Or you miss the Board of Review objection deadline and you're stuck for that year. And that can be very frustrating. So all things to consider. So this might have closed up a little bit early, but if people have questions on the exciting world of the property tax appeals, I'm here to listen.
What about the people that come in and they want to go to the tax assessor and then charge you for the next 3 years, so much of the savings?
Well, some of those, that's essentially sometimes their business model. There are tax agencies out there that come in and work on a contingency fee basis, and that's how they get paid, is on the amount of savings that they can get for somebody. Sometimes they can be effective, but sometimes they're not, and then you have to get a lawyer. The tax, if you go with a tax agent, they can't litigate. Normally, they can't litigate cases in Wisconsin Circuit Court unless they've got a license or they hire a lawyer, and that could be an additional cost. So those are things to consider is if you're going to have representation, what sort of business model they have. Some lawyers charge hourly basis, some lawyers charge contingency fee for these things too. Tax agents do the same thing. They have a lot of expertise oftentimes, but sometimes, it's really just a personal preference as to who you might want to have assistance with. What else?
Expand the distance away from a property compared to a golf course. That's always the biggest issue. You're counting, you can't count that property that was sold.
Can you repeat the first part of what you said? Did they expand?
The distance away from like another golf course was sold.
Mm-hmm. Like in terms of some sort of requirement as to what, like
we're in Waukesha County.
Yeah.
The course sold, down in Kenosha. You see, that's too far away.
Oh yeah, that's a common assessor trope that they take out. They'll say it's not comparable for whatever reason. How many golf courses sell in Wisconsin? You've got to look at all the facts. When they say something like that, that just says to me that they don't want to look at the sale. They oftentimes will see the sale and like, well, that course was under some economic distress, so it sold lower than what it should have. It shouldn't have sold at $5 million. It should have sold at $15 million. They translate the same arguments from larger commercial properties to courses, and income has something to do with it too. That's why you want to try to push for it to be comparable sales as much as possible.
Yeah, with golf courses, you can't get a comparable sale
Well, that's hard. That's why, you know, especially in Waukesha County. So you'll have lawyers, well, this wasn't in Waukesha County. Well, you got to be reasonable. You got to do the best you can. And then ultimately, if you appeal that to a circuit court, you've got to sell that to a judge. And the judges oftentimes, they don't love these cases. You know, nobody wants to, you know, hear a property tax fight. And so they don't know a lot about the specific area of the law all the time. So you have to keep that in mind when you're litigating these and trying these cases, and a lot of times they resolve. But sometimes some of these attorneys that the assessors hire and the cities hire, good attorneys, but can be very difficult to deal with and work with. So that's why I try to say, you know, if there's a way you can reach a resolution with the assessor or early on, it's best to do it that way, because there can be a great disparity in what your appraiser might say versus what the city says the value of the property is. And then when you go into a trial situation, if you have a situation where the judge chooses either or, and there's $5 million in the difference, judges, you know, aren't always going to say, well, let's split it down the middle. You might get that at a board of review type situation, but they don't normally do that. They normally just kind of sustain them nowadays, in my experience. So again, probably the most cost-effective thing to do is try to resolve these and get savings out over time rather than swing for a big victory. Just my view. Go ahead, sir.
If you have some property designated as environmental corridor, does it affect your assessment?
As in environmental what?
Environmental corridor, on the land use plans?
Well, it could, and that's another thing that is important to know. How is in terms of what you own as a land, how is it zoned? Is some of it zoned as agricultural or farmland as opposed to recreation, golf course? That may have some impact on it. Again, to the extent of how much it might be and where it is on the property, you might have to have an appraiser look at that and make those decisions about how much that might be. Oh, sir.
We have leased land and we pay personal property tax. There's been a number of legislation put forth about it. Can you speak to what you see as the future of that?
In terms of personal property tax? Well, it's something that kind of goes back and forth depending on who's in there. I know in terms of there's a lot of manufacturing property tax exemptions out there right now. I don't think that necessarily applies in this situation. But, you know, in terms of the personal property, you tend to, it's kind of a self-report type system in Wisconsin. So you need to make sure you have, how do I say it, some synergy with how you report it on your federal taxes and your other taxes with how you report the property with the state of Wisconsin. And you may have, there are people who can evaluate the personal property and things on your property too. In terms of business appraisers, they can evaluate the carts, they can evaluate the kitchen items, the bars, you know, things like that, to make sure that that's accurate, because, you know, you can save some money that way too. But you've got to be careful in how you do it, and you don't want to have a situation where you self-report it as you know, $500,000 worth of property on the state form, and then on some other form you say, oh well, it's $2 million or something. You don't want to have them not jive. So. What else? Any other property tax or any other liability questions you might have missed? Okay. All right, well, thank you.